Apr.22 Power Play on this Tuesday evening. Tonight, the cost of campaign promises.
Hang on. Have hope. Help is on the way.
There's a phantom growth that comes from the sky in his platform.
Both of them, I think, don't have the right priorities when it comes to spending that type of money.
All three major parties outside of Quebec have now released their costed platforms. Do the numbers, however, add up? And what do the platforms, as well as the timing of their release, say about this campaign? Our front bench is coming up in moments to talk about that. Then they will assess the state of the race. Public opinion polls show Liberals and Conservatives at historic levels of support, with the Bloc leader even going so far as to say Mark Carney will win the election. We're going to talk about that shortly. Plus, Pope Francis is now lying in state. The Vatican has released the details for the pontiff's funeral. Our Geneviève Beauchemin will join us from Vatican City with the latest a little bit later on in the show. First, though,
We will cut the Liberal deficit by 70% by cutting back on bureaucracy, consultants, foreign aid to dictators, terrorists, and global bureaucracies, slashing money for special interests, and unleashing $500 billion of extra economic growth.
Earlier today, the Conservative Party released their platform, and it really only confirms what we already knew. That Pierre Poilievre has no plan to stand up to President Trump.
Pierre Poilievre released his platform. He laid out his plan, and not surprisingly, it includes massive cuts. He's cutting, and that's what we expect of Conservatives. That's what they do.
with just 6 days left in the campaign, all three political parties, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP, have now finally released their costed platforms. The Conservatives today laying out their plan for new spending and cuts. The Tories are the last major party to unveil that platform, which largely focuses on cost of living measures, while the Liberal plan centers around the trade war. The NDP platform includes several measures on affordability and healthcare. So let's take a closer look at the numbers they're all spelling out. The Conservative platform includes $110 billion in new spending and tax cuts over 4 years, with projected but declining deficits over that period. The Liberals are pledging $130 billion in new measures over the same period, with deficits throughout. And the NDP platform includes $227 billion in new spending and adds $48 billion to the federal deficit over the next 4 years, which would be stacked on top of the deficit that exists at the moment. We were scheduled to have a panel of candidates tonight to debate the merits of their respective platforms, but unfortunately, despite a commitment from the Liberals to put up the chair of their National Platform Committee and a commitment earlier from the Conservatives to have a candidate available this afternoon, the Conservatives said they would no longer be providing someone. Actually, just 30 minutes ago, they officially confirmed that. Joining me now with what voters need to know about the platforms these parties are putting forward is CTV's Colton Prale. Hi, Colton.
Hi.
Good to see you. Let's go top line, because a lot of what the Conservatives have been talking about during this campaign is the making your life more affordable through means like, for example, a tax cut. What did we learn today about when that stuff is coming?
Well, the headline numbers look good, right? Like almost $75 billion worth of tax cuts are in this plan. But some of the biggest and most important tax cuts that I think Canadians are looking forward to, you think, for example, the tax cut on the income bracket, 15% or 2.25 percentage points, that's very slow to come into this plan. We're looking at $30 billion worth of spend over 4 years, but only $1 billion budgeted in the first year and less than $6 billion in the second year. That's a very slow timeline to get to the income tax that you promised Canadians, and a timeline that wasn't highlighted in their news release or in the background, or even when they first unveiled that platform. That is something that we're learning today. You look at, for example, the savings that he's promised seniors, the first $34,000 of your work, tax-free. That also doesn't come into effect next year. And so we see this across the platform of these promises being back-ended because in large part this platform relies on revenue coming back in. The first couple of years are tough because they're making a lot of cuts, but they expect to generate a lot of revenue. And so the bulk of their actual tax cuts don't come in until that revenue is in place down the road. And there are big questions around that revenue as well.
Well, I want to pick up on that because the questions, I think, surround the idea that a lot of what they are saying they are going to make better for the economy in their view. So, for example, taking away regulations or burdensome red tape, taking away something like C-69, which is, supposed to regulate things like building pipelines. They call it the No Pipelines Act, things like that. They are then sort of assuming a corresponding economic impact in order to arrive at the point that they ultimately do about, how much revenue they're taking in versus how much they're spending. How uncommon is that?
This is something that, for starters, we don't see it in the Liberal platform, for example. I spoke with an economist today who told me, in his history making budgets, politicians very frequently like to do this, and it's something he fought back against for decades because it's very difficult to predict what those numbers will look like in 4 years' time, especially true in the timeline that we're in right now with Donald Trump in the White House. It's hard enough to predict the economic impacts a year out, let alone 4 years out. But, to give you an idea on some of these revenue-boosting measures, for example, cracking down on tax havens. They have that as almost $13 billion. That's the kind of promise we see governments make over and over and over again, but we have seen very little progress in that frame. You look at the cutting red tape measures, for example, that's supposed to bring in $6.5 billion over 4 years. These are measures that, if they work the way they are being told or explained to us that they will, then there's incredible benefit. But if so much of that is back-ended, and if it's contingent upon essentially doubling our GDP over 4 years, there is an element to question there. If that's actually something that Pierre Poilievre and his team believe is going to happen in the next 4 years.
Just the fact that it's contingent on X, Y, and Z means it's hard to know exactly what it's going to be. And to that effect, both the Liberals and the Conservatives don't even take into account the potential negative impacts of tariffs, which would definitely expand and size the deficit going forward. And just finally, one quick question for you. A couple other little nuggets, like in the Liberals the other day, we saw things that we hadn't seen announced before. What are your little takeaways from the finalized document being produced?
There were two things in here that really stood out to me. The first, the mention of CANZUK. This was something that we saw in the platform that I haven't heard Pierre Poilievre say at any point in the campaign trail, but a potential free trade agreement, Canada, UK, New Zealand, and Australia, is something that has been talked about for a number of years, but hasn't seen a lot of movement on. It wasn't a very specific highlight, but just the fact that it got mentioned, I think, is an interesting element to diversifying our trade. The bigger one, and I think what I was looking for throughout this campaign, was, what is your climate plan? What does it look like? And we found the money here, and it doesn't appear that there is much of one. That climate plan seems to be, as he explained on the campaign trail, in large part shipping LNG to countries that use predominantly coal power and counting their emission reductions as our own through Article 6, which
countries have never really been able to figure out how to implement that.
It's been a challenge to implement
Paris.
that.
Yeah. Okay, Colton, thank you so much. Great analysis. I appreciate it. That's our Colton Prail. We've got some brand new numbers from Elections Canada now about how many of you cast a ballot during advance voting. The organization says 7.3 million Canadians voted over the 4-day period, which is 25% higher than did so in 2021. And actually, we found out late today, sets an all-time record for the number of Canadians that voted in advance polls. Let's talk about what that could mean and what we should take from the party's platforms with our front bench. Former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant is here. He's the CEO of Space Canada now. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt is with us. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Less than a week to go. Tom, I was texting you earlier trying to figure out when it was in 2015 that your party released its platform, and I had a feeling that it was earlier than advance voting. That has normally been the case for most of the parties. In this case, nobody got theirs out in advance of the debate. The Liberals and the NDP, it was the second day of advance voting, and now the Conservatives after advance voting has closed. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that they didn't think it was going to have a very important effect on people's voting patterns. They had to go through this. It's like the compulsory exercises in figure skating in the Olympics. You have to do this and this and this. And so they had to come out with a costed platform. But so much of it, as Colton was just explaining, so much of it is wishful thinking. You know, on the Liberal side, well, it's all this money that's going to fall into our lap because we've got these counter tariffs. And on the Conservative side, it's, well, don't you know that what we've just put forward here is going to grow the economy exponentially, and all this money is going to be flowing in, so it won't be a problem. I also remember, bless her, Bev Oda's orange juice, and every time we talk about these big numbers, and I'm not taking anything away from the ability or the thoughtfulness of the average Canadian voter, but when you're starting to say that you're going to go from a $45 billion deficit down to $38 billion the second year, and it takes 15 minutes to explain it, the average person just says, okay, you're all full of prunes. You're all telling me I'm going to get a big tax reduction. It's going to cost nothing. The economy is going to go great. And the reason that we're all told that we have to be just careful in our choices because there's a real threat from the United States with the tariffs. So it's all a contradiction. It's a game that's being played. It's something they have to go through. And I think that on balance, I think that Poilievre did as well as he could. He didn't just seem, he actually expressed his frustration that nobody was as outraged as he was about how lousy the Liberal numbers were. But welcome to the election campaign, then explain why they're lousy and show why yours are better. But you sense that deep frustration starting to take hold in the Conservative camp, and it came out again today.
Lisa, what's your takeaway from the platform? And do you agree with what Tom's saying insofar as nobody really placed a primacy on providing those details to Canadians because their messaging, basically, one around stability, the other around change, perhaps, they thought would resonate more?
I would say that both parties tried to rejig, I would say, how we're presenting a platform. So in the case of the Liberals, what they try to do is separate out expending and have part of it an operating budget and part of it a capital budget. And it really did go over the heads of a lot of Canadians. And it does sound like it's going to be a nightmare in moving the machinery of government to do something like that. On the side of the Conservatives, they are relying upon showing revenues coming as they change the regulatory system in order to bring in more business investment. I mean, they've got a couple of people who have reviewed it and said that the numbers are good. They've got, Phil Cross and they've got Tim Sargent, who are well known as being involved with either Finance Canada or with Stats Canada. So they've covered off what they need to cover off in terms of the platform. But to your question directly, does it really matter? No one's listening to this stuff about platforms. What people are trying to figure out is how they're going to vote. I think, actually, if I want to put a fine point on it, I think people are trying to figure out who's going to win. And they want to be on the winning side. We're at the point where people want to vote with the winner. And that, in the world of a politician, is absolutely terrifying because you don't know what they're talking about and you don't quite know where it's all going to go.
Brian, what do you make about the timing of the platforms and what's your takeaway from them?
Yeah, I think Lisa and Tom's points are bang on. It was obviously a strategic decision to wait until the weekend of advance polling. And look, times have changed, right? We're all used to sort of an election, or we still have in our psyche that an election is on election day, but there's people that vote throughout. You can vote at returning offices throughout the campaign, and then you have advance voting that seems to be garnishing more and more interest and participation, as we've seen. Must be some type of record, I'm assuming, with 7 million Canadians having voted this past weekend. So look, it means that those 7 million people, they're not going to change they may change their minds, but they ain't going to change their votes, right? Yeah. So the idea that they waited for the platform definitely demonstrates this wasn't something that either one of the two, as we call them, traditional parties would think will garnish any more support, kind of sway any voters. And instead, I mean, I can't, I'm not in their psyche, but I'm assuming Carney and his team are like, look, we don't necessarily want people talking about the minutia of our platform. We want them talking about what we're going to do on Trump, right? We want every cycle, as much as we possibly can, to be about that. And I'm guessing to some extent Poilievre had the same, and his team had the same type of calculation, but maybe more so for affordability, and maybe more so for sort of the track record of the Liberal government over the last 10 years and not the Carney government. So maybe the two camps basically said, those are our messages. We actually don't want anything to get in the way, including our own ideas, including our own promises and our own platform. So I'm assuming that's what the calculation is. And frankly, I think, again, alluding to Lisa and Tom's points, I'm not sure that most Canadians, especially in this election, would have been combing through the platforms to decide who to vote for anyway. I think the issues are so major. There's a handful of major issues, and they want to hear the parties and more specifically the leaders on those.
I think, to be the Pollyanna, Benzie, of the group, I think I would say there are some Canadians, and I hear from them a lot, who care a lot about the specifics of what the parties put forward. I don't want to sort of diminish the people who do care. I understand the strategic imperative. Because even when you look at the way in which the two platforms were released, it kind of substantiates what Tom, Lisa, and Brian said, insofar as the Liberals released theirs, and the first thing people said was, this sounds like something Justin Trudeau had written, which went counter to the message that Mark Carney has been trying to deliver throughout the entirety of the campaign. The Conservatives released theirs today, and the first thing people thought is, like, what math are you relying on? And the budget isn't balanced, as you said it would be, which again takes away from the message that they want to deliver around change and around a host of other things. So I get it from a strategic perspective. I think it sucks.
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, all the parties would put out their platforms on the first day of an election campaign, and we would also have 5 debates on specific subjects, foreign policy, domestic policy, healthcare, whatever. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a not a bad country, Canada, and I think that it's a good sign, Vashi, that. I think between a third and a quarter of Canadians have voted already in this election. That's extraordinary. So it means we're probably going to have, 60+% turnout, maybe even 70% turnout. People are engaged. I don't know who they're going to vote for, but I know what the polls say, and I know what the advertising strategy suggests. And it looks to me like this thing, I don't want to say it's baked yet, but the cake is getting close to being done. And unless there's some kind of a final week surprise, I don't think it's going to be quite as dramatic a night a week from yesterday as I might have thought, or you might have thought, or any of us might have thought on New Year's Day when we were talking about what was going to happen in the next election. This is it's quite extraordinary what's transpired over the last 6 to 8 weeks, and I've never seen anything like it. But I will not be surprised if it's a Liberal majority government. Maybe it's a Liberal minority government if the Liberals start to fade in Quebec, but they're not fading here in Ontario. Lisa knows this province really well. She lives here. I live here. They're at 50%. The Liberals are in Ontario, and I can't believe that. I'm stunned that they are still so high, and the Tories are at roughly 39% or whatever, which is really good in a normal year. That's a majority government in a normal year, but this isn't a normal year.
Well, that's exactly what I want to unpack in our discussion after a short commercial break. The front bench is sticking around. We're going to take a look at the state of that race with historic levels of support for both parties. We're back in a moment for that discussion.
We are in the worst crisis of our lives. It takes a serious government. It takes a serious plan. It takes a plan that delivers today. It takes a plan that delivers investment. It takes a plan that grows this economy, stands up to Trump, and moves forward.
Change so that you can afford food and housing. Change so that you can live on a safe street. Change to put Canada first. Change is what we need now more than ever.
You have the power in this election to use that power to vote for New Democrats to say, no, I don't want to see cuts to healthcare. I don't want to see cuts to services. You've got the power to send us to Ottawa to hold the line for you, to defend what you care about.
Welcome back to Power Play. A clear representation there of closing arguments from all 3 major parties outside of Quebec in these final days of the campaign. The Liberals are pitching a steady hand, the Conservatives change, and the NDP a check on government power, not forming government themselves. The Bloc leader, for his part this week, said Mark Carney will form government in a bid to also pitch himself and his party as a check on government. What does it tell us about the state of the race as the campaign comes to its close? Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie are here. Back here, I should say, to talk about that. Lisa, I'll start with you. I feel, my sense is, and I could be wrong, the Conservative message around change, both delivered vis-a-vis the leader, but also through ads, has solidified in particular over the last 9 or 10 days. Do you think they would be in a better position if that message had been stronger at the start of the campaign?
No, I don't. I think we are where we are right now. And you can quarterback this as much as you want in terms of trying to figure out what we should have done at what point. The reality is that we are exactly where we need to be right now. We're talking about change. We're pointing out the fact that the Liberals have been in power for 10 years, and they're not really talking about that much change. In fact, you can look at their platform and see that it's very similar and the same people, all of that stuff. So that all makes sense. I'll tell you what I'm hearing at the doors, though. As Benzie pointed out, I have been out in Ontario. I've been out in Cape Breton as well. And if I could sum it up in one kind of thought without hopefully ticking off all of my friends, what I am hearing from people who are not giving Conservatives their vote is that they like the Conservative policies, but they want Mark Carney to implement them. And I don't know how you defend against that.
What do you say?
Well, then you just go back and say the only way that you're going to get the policies is if you elect a Conservative leader.
Right.
But that's kind of what it comes down to. It comes down to the fact that they are, as they're discerning where their vote is going to go, they think that the policy platform is sound. What they're not thrilled about, unfortunately, is our leader.
What does that say to you, Brian?
Well, so look, I've just reacting on the spot, thinking out loud with just, our close friends here, no one else listening. I would say that, and I made this point before, Poilievre, I truly believe, has been one of the more effective leader of the oppositions. I would say one person on this panel was at top of the list as well, a very effective leader of the opposition. But I'll tell you that Poilievre, I think, was very good. And Tom has had to do this. I had to do this. And it's not an easy dance where you are trying to fulfill your role as the leader of the opposition and then at the same time basically audition, basically interview with Canadians, in my case, New Brunswickers, to become the premier or the prime minister, depending on the case. So it's not easy to strike that balance. And I think Poilievre was so effective at being the leader of the opposition, and he saw the numbers grow so large, and he saw nothing but momentum that I'm not sure that necessarily he or his team or both understood that they also had to start to give some moments of being prime ministerial, whatever that means nowadays, but showing his plan, showing what he's about. And I actually do think they've tried to do that a little bit in the campaign. I listened to a podcast he was on, some sort of random podcast, and I thought Poilievre did quite well. I didn't necessarily agree with everything he said on a policy front, but he came across trying to talk, I would say, not as a leader of the opposition. And he actually acknowledged the point that I'm making, by the way, that he said in that podcast when asked, like, what would you say to somebody if they said that you seem too aggressive? And that's the point he made. So I think he's probably aware of it, at least now, if he wasn't the whole time. So I wonder if there's a bit of that going on, because I do think he was an effective leader of the opposition, but people don't necessarily want that as their prime minister or their leader. And I think probably even more so, given the circumstances we find ourselves in. They want somebody that's going to feel like they're unifying, that it's going to be a leadership that brings people together. And when you're so effective as leader of the opposition for 2 years, maybe it's hard to build that brand.
Tom, I wanted to get you on the NDP as well, because we played that clip of Jagmeet saying a lot of questions directed to him today were, what happens if you lose official party status? Will you resign? Like, we're not even, in the final few days of this campaign. Those are questions you expect, like, after the election, for example. What does it say to you that he is basically, since week 2 of this campaign, being dogged by those questions?
It's extraordinarily difficult. He's a warrior. He's put on a good fight, but it's been an election where there are only 2 parties that are fighting it out, duking it out. We've said it a couple of times, but it's worth reiterating that in 2011, when Mr. Harper won his majority, he had 39% of the vote, which is exactly where Poilievre is now. The problem for him, of course, is that the Liberals have been eating the NDP vote, and believe me, in Quebec, eating the Bloc vote, something fierce. And it's just been propelling them up. They have an effective, efficient vote. It's well spread out, and they're eating, they're taking in that many votes from the other parties. Hearing Mr. Singh say that reminded me of what I heard Mr. Blanchette say on Sunday night. It was his turn on Tout le monde en parle. And he admitted, as you correctly pointed out, Vashi, that Carney's going to win. And now that gets very tricky for everybody, because the Liberals are out there trying to slowly, push, things are going well, but nothing's set in stone yet, and don't take a chance. And we're not really doing that well because they want people to come and vote. And the other parties are saying, no, it's a done deal. So send some of us there to try to hold the line, to try to block them. That's the Bloc Québécois pitch. They're not going to care about Quebec stuff. Carney doesn't care about Quebec. Send a few more of us. The Bloc right now is at 35 seats. There is a real possibility for them to drop to between 15 and 20. And if I just said 15, then I'm starting to talk about the 12. That is the magic number to be an official party, which they are. Mr. Singh knows that that's his real, difficulty right now is that number 12. He's got to ensure that he gets that. Look at where he's going to be. He's going to be in Edmonton. He's got, he's going to hit every riding that he can where he thinks he can shore up the vote and hold on to a seat. There are some longtime NDP MPs who are in trouble. Some of them decided, turns out quite wisely, that this might be the election to step down. But Mr. Singh knows what the result's going to be. I think he's serene in his understanding of what it might mean for him, and I'm not getting any indication that he's intent of fighting to stay on. He's done a good job for the time that he's there, but I think that the party's going to go through a real difficult time if and when if the result is the one that's being predicted in the polls. The party will go through a difficult time, especially if they do lose party status.
Just very quickly, if those results do bear out, do you think he can stay on as leader?
No, and I'm not getting any bead off him, any bearing off him that he's intending to stick around and to hold on to it. I'm getting the sense that, his family, he's been working out of Ottawa with a riding in British Columbia and the core of his family support in Toronto. I think that the guy's, he's paid his dues. And I think at some point he's just going to be able to leave with his head held high, especially if he can hold on to the 12 seats. And we'll see whether or not that works out for him.
The story of the NDP, Benzie, in this is, it's hard to overstate its significance, right? Because as you were pointing out prior to the break, Harper won a majority with 39% of the vote. Poilievre has expanded the Conservative base, right? To hit from, the percentages that Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole got. It's just that the NDP, I think in 2011, and someone can correct, I think they were at 30%. Yeah. And now they're at 10. And all of that support has migrated to the Liberals, which has produced such a different outcome if, in fact, the polls are borne out on Monday.
Yeah, I mean, Vashi, one of the most stupid things, the most moronic things that the Tory campaign did was in the pre-RIP period spending millions of dollars on advertising, attacking quote-unquote sellout Singh. And the Jagmeet Singh ads that they ran last fall, I still don't understand what they were thinking, because it's a three-dimensional chess game when you're the Conservatives in this country, whether you're in Ontario or federally. You need a strong NDP or a strong-ish NDP to siphon votes from the Liberals. So why you would want to demonize the New Democratic leader just because he wouldn't support you in defeating the Trudeau government of the day? I'm sure when the postmortems of this are written, and some of them will be very ugly, mark my words, because I'm going to be writing some of them. I can tell just from what people are already telling me that they're not going to be, it's not going to be a pretty picture. One of the great chapters will be, why did the Tories attack the New Democrats when they didn't really need to?
Lisa, you may have a better answer from the people I have asked that question of. It comes from, I know this may sound weird, but it comes from a place where they are very critical of the NDP. They vehemently disagree with the approach that Jagmeet Singh took and the party took. They vehemently disagree with the positions that they, upheld of the Liberals that allowed them to stay in power. Strategically, I totally understand what Rob's pointing out, but I think my guess is that that's where it comes from.
But you also have to remember that we not only compete with the Liberals in seats, we compete with the NDP for seats. So you kind of have to take both leaders at what they are in order to be able to take away some of the vote. And quite frankly, I think Pierre has been very successful in getting some of those lunchbox votes to come over to the Conservative. Look at all of the endorsements that he is getting from unions. I mean, I never would have expected that would have happened in 2015 by any means. In fact, it was quite the opposite. And that kind of vote was drawn also from the Liberals, but a lot was coming from the NDP. And we're competitive in ridings in Northern Ontario that we were not really as competitive before. So I do think, with all respect to what Rob said, I do think it was successful in getting some of the vote, but maybe it was just a little too successful. Look, I think we should have, now that I know that Mr. Trudeau left in January, maybe we shouldn't have been so hard on him either. I don't know. Maybe we should have kind of lulled him into some kind of semblance of calmness that he was going to make it through the spring, if only. I mean, we'd be in a different world right now. But hey, effective advertising is effective advertising. And you know what? Maybe the Conservatives got a last kick in the can between now and now on Election Day. Like I said before, I'm a Leafs fan, so I'm an ever optimist.
We got to be in that respect, Lisa.
Yes.
Brian, last word to
Go
you
Leafs.
on that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it goes back to it goes back to being an effective leader of the opposition in the sense that they wanted Trudeau to go. They wanted the carbon tax to be eliminated. They were sort of dumping on Singh, and they got maybe what they wanted, but as Lisa was sort of jokingly saying, maybe too much. One of the things that I always thought, though, that they were doing that for, and maybe I was completely wrong, I find on this panel we're often trying to figure out what people are thinking. My sense was always that they were actually trying to also push Singh to just bring down the government. Like it felt like they were trying
for sure.
to apply pressure, right? So that they feel it at the doorstep, and I'm sure they were hoping Singh's MPs, the NDP MPs, would come to Singh and be like, we got to get this government to fall. Like I think they were trying to just get the election, maybe to Lisa's point that they would have gone with these circumstances that they were used to for the sort of year and a half before everything sort of changed in the last 3-4 months. And look, I think at the end of the day, we find ourselves here. It feels like I've always felt like after the long weekend, things would probably be pretty cemented. The polling seems to have stayed pretty stable throughout the campaign, frankly. 7 million people have already voted. So I think, Benji, not to paraphrase you, not to put words in your mouth, but I think, as you mentioned, it'd be hard to think anything would completely shift things over the next few days. But anything can happen. 24 hours in politics is a long time.
Yeah, and we've got 6 of those 24-hour periods. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the conversation tonight. Our front bench, Brian Gallant, Lisa Raitt, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. We'll take a short break here on Power Play. After that break, we're going to head to the Vatican. The Pope's funeral is now set for Saturday. Geneviève Beauchemin is there and will fill us in on the latest reaction in St. Peter's Square to Pope Francis's passing. Back in a moment with that. Tributes continue to pour in for Pope Francis, who is now lying in state ahead of his funeral. The Vatican releasing the first images today of the pontiff lying in an open coffin in a Vatican chapel. Officials from the Vatican gathered there earlier today to pray and say their goodbyes. Then beginning tomorrow, the public is going to have its chance to pay their respects. The Pope's body will be transferred in a procession to St. Peter's Basilica tomorrow morning, where he will lie in state for 3 days before his funeral, which is set to be held on Saturday. A live look now at St. Peter's Square, where mourners continue to gather throughout the evening and did so throughout the day. This is where the funeral will be held. Tens of thousands of people are expected to attend, including world leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, U.S. President Donald Trump, and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Canada's Prime Minister has not yet confirmed if he or his office has not yet confirmed whether he will step away from the campaign to attend. It's still unclear who at this point will be representing Canada at that funeral. When we do know, though, we will share it with you. CTV's Geneviève Beauchemin is in Vatican City now. She has more on the funeral details. Geneviève?
Rosary prayers are being held tonight at St. Peter's Square. That's part of the rituals and traditions of the Catholic Church that have been set into motion since the cardinals met this morning here in Rome for the first assembly. They set out the timeline of what will happen next. Of course, these are traditions. These are things that are repeated for every one of these occasions, every one of the passings of the Pope. But this time, there are subtleties, there are differences according to the wishes of Pope Francis. And so the timeline has now been set. So we know that as tomorrow morning, the body of the Pope will be moved to St. Peter's Basilica. It is now, for the moment, still at Casa Santa Marta. That's where he lived. Very simply, that's where he passed away. And for now, there has been a public viewing for only those who were closest to him, including the employees here of the Vatican. Those who have seen the Pope lying in state so far say it's a very emotional moment, and it's one that many thousands and thousands of people are expected to share, because over the next few days, once the body is moved to St. Peter's Basilica, there will be the public viewing. And people have already been flocking to Rome. We spoke to people from Ontario today who are here and hope to be in that lineup tomorrow. They're from a parish in Stittsville. They say that they were coming here for the Jubilee year of the church, and they happen to be here for this occasion, this very solemn and occasion, they say, and they're eager to pay their respects to the Pope. Now, once that public viewing is ended. That will happen on Saturday morning. And at 10 a.m. here, Rome time, will be the funeral for Pope Francis. That will unfold according to the traditions of the church. And then after that, the body will be taken. There will be a procession through the streets of Rome where the body of the Pope will be taken to St. Mary Major Basilica. That's a basilica that is close to the heart of the Pope, and that's where he asked to be buried, in a very simple wooden coffin. There will also be a tomb there, and the only inscription there will be Franciscus. And again, that's according to the wishes of the Pope, who hoped for this to be very simple, to be much like the burial of any Christian. And so he's hoping that it will be something that will be carried out. He had hoped this would be something that would be carried out simply, though, of course, there are so many traditions that are underway that have to be followed. And that's part of the process now that will unfold over the next few days before, of course, the conclave is held. And that will be held a little bit later in the days after the mourning period is over. Vashi.
Thanks so much, Jean-Pierre Boschman in Vatican City. Coming up on Power Play tonight, we're going to return to the campaign trail. The Tories have now released their platform. Canadians have all three main parties' platforms in their hands. Does the math make sense? We're going to break out the calculator with an economist to find out. Don Drummond is my next guest.
In the past, I've told you that there would be a dollar for dollar law. We've gone even further. Every dollar of new spending in our platform, especially for things like defense, will be met with $1.50 in savings.
There's a phantom growth that comes from the sky in his platform that arrives and changes his numbers, even though he doesn't have a plan to fight against President Trump.
Both of them, I think, don't have the right priorities when it comes to spending that type of money on millionaires and then proposing massive cuts for you and your family. I think that's the wrong priority.
Our top story today, the Conservatives have released their costed platform. Voters now have a sense of how all the major parties are going to pay for the promises they've made during the campaign. Does all the math, however, add up? Economist and fellow resident at C.D. Howe Institute, Don Drummond, is with me now. He spent 23 years in the Department of Finance helping shape Canada's fiscal policy. Hi, Mr. Drummond. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, you're welcome.
I appreciate it. I wanted to start off, I was reading through your analysis of kind of in the aggregate, the platforms that have been put forward. And one of the first lines that you wrote jumped out to me, that basically we have some clarity on what they're going to do around the economy, but that the quote clarity does little to diminish our concerns. Why have you reached that conclusion?
I think in Canada, we're in a very serious economic position. Of late, our GDP output per capita, so what we get per person, is just flatlined. All our growth has come from population. We've had a miserable productivity growth rate since around 2000, and it's just gotten worse. We have far less capital per worker than other countries. We, of course, now realize it was a terrible mistake to allow ourselves to be so dependent upon the U.S. economy. 3/4 of our exports going there. We needed to do bold, creative, new things to do that. The Conservatives and the Liberals have some ideas to bolster economic growth. They're not particularly creative. They're not particularly bold. So disappointed on that front. And we have a very vulnerable fiscal position. We've been in these 50 billion plus deficits for some time. We have a net GDP ratio of over 40%. And basically, if you update the Liberal and the Conservative numbers and look at the NDP number, update it for the tariff impact, they're basically saying we're just going to lock in the inadequate, vulnerable fiscal position we've had. There's no balance in the budget, and the Conservatives, as they said that they were going to do, there's no keeping the deficit under 1% of GDP, as the Liberals said they would do. The numbers don't add up to those commitments. And at the end of it, they don't take much out of spending. And particularly the surprise is on the Conservative side. Out of roughly $500 billion of spending, excluding interest on the public debt, they're only proposing to take out about $10 billion a year. And in just one narrow category, contract budgets. The rest of it gets a free ride.
Why does the fiscal position of the federal government matter in layman's terms? And I ask you because the parties appear to have reached a political consensus that there's more to lose politically in this election by focusing on fiscal restraint, or even, a more balanced fiscal position than there is to be gained by keeping a lot of the spending that you just outlined. Like, why does it matter to Canadians if there is, some attention paid to our fiscal position?
So one of the ways it shows up is a portion of the money you send through your taxes to Ottawa. How much of that goes to come back to things that Canadians want and need, old age security payments, employment insurance, defense, and how much of it goes to pay on the interest in the public debt. Just as a household, that interest in the public debt is not giving anybody any service tomorrow. That's paying on things we consumed from the past. And as that ratio rises, the taxpayers' money goes to less and less. And already we have over 10% of everything Canadians send to the federal government just literally gets burned on interest in the public debt. In the mid-1990s, it hit as high as 30%. I'm not saying we're at that crisis level, but it slowly drains the possibility of funding the things that people want. It needs to be paid back. It's a very unfair intergenerational burden. Particularly the debt run-up that was incurred during COVID, those actions benefited Canadians of the day, and they should be paying it back over a period of time. But basically, it's being bundled up, put away to the side for the moment, and is saying some young people or even a future generation will have to pay that, but they're going to have their own needs. And particularly at a time where we've got this aging of the Canadian population, a doubling of the 65 plus in the next 20 years, a tripling of the 75 plus population, that we're going to need the resources to be able to offer people the public services they want and need at a low tax rate. And you can't do that when you've got these big debt ratios. The problem is it doesn't all blow apart in a day, but it steadily chokes the economy and people's finances.
I wanted to ask you on each of the Liberals and the Conservatives, to reality check, I guess, one key part of the fiscal framework they put forward. For the Conservatives in their release of the platform today, the reason why there isn't more spending cuts to achieve ultimately the position that they lay out is because they are very much banking on increases to the revenue of the federal government based on economic growth. So like taking away regulations, taking away C-69, incentivizing house building, that will all, according to this document, greatly benefit federal coffers. Is there a way to seriously, know exactly what that outcome will be and to build it into your budget the way they have?
Yeah, first, before getting into that, I should note both the Liberals and the Conservatives use a set of economic and fiscal assumptions given to them by the Parliamentary Budget Office, which was done in March, and it doesn't include any negative effects from the U.S. tariffs, the Canadian retaliation, and this dark, dark cloud of uncertainty hanging over the Canadian and global economy. If I just take one outfit's adjustment of what that would do to these fiscal outlooks, it would add over $11 billion a year by 2027 to their fiscal outlook. So they already got released in the case of the Conservatives this morning, but they're already out of date. Actually, the NDP actually, I think, very sensibly used the economic scenarios in the Bank of Canada's April 2025 monetary policy report. It does address explicitly the damage. So we have to add a buffer to what we're seeing there. Yes, this accounting for the induced effects is very unusual. I worked on budgets for 23 years. There was rarely a budget the politicians didn't want to include those. I think we succeeded more often than not in not putting them in. There's one old chestnut that came up all the time, is that we're going to tell the CRA to be tougher on tax compliance and crack down on tax havens. And let's count a couple of $1 billion flowing from that. But your question is spot on. Could I or you or anybody in 5 years' time and look up in the public accounts and say, yep, they got it, or they didn't get it, or they got more of it? No way. You will never know. These things never produce the kind of revenue they're doing it. Reducing the regulation, first you got to do it. And there's not even a description of the process we're going to do it. You have to have the economic effect. We have no idea what kind of economic activity, and we will never be able to measure it ex post. So I say, those should be kept out of fiscal documents. I did my best when I was at finance to make sure they didn't get in there.
Final question for you, Mr. Drummond, is to reality check the Liberals. One of their key kind of assumptions that they put forward, or not even assumptions, just structural changes. They've separated out what they're calling a capital budget from an operational budget, and therefore able to say, oh, we are cutting spending on one side, and sort of it doesn't count as spending if it's investment in something like a hospital or even more broad. I don't even know what else it could encompass, actually, because we don't even have all the details. What do you think of that practice?
I tend to ignore it. First of all, capital spending, infrastructure is good. We need more. We definitely need the transportation mean to get our products to ports and get them to countries other than the United States. But we've always separated that. We've always been able to see what we spend there. Whether they're creating a new concept of an operating deficit and a capital budget really means nothing to me, because with one little calculation, you've always been able to determine. The bottom line is that they are continuing to run about $50 billion deficits. And if you adjust for the tariff effect, they'd be over $60 billion. That's 1.67% of GDP, whereas they said they were going to keep it under 1%. But so I don't just leave it a negative on the Liberals. The Conservatives said they're going to balance the budget. Their plan doesn't come close, doesn't include that tariff effect, and they've got this creative accounting on all these induced revenues. So all the political parties just project big deficits and a lot of debt going forward with lots of spending.
Well, I appreciate your factual analysis this evening. Thanks very much for making the time, Mr. Drummond.
You're welcome. Bye.
That is Don Drummond, who spent more than 2 decades in the Department of Finance here in our federal government. We'll take a quick commercial break. More election coverage after that break here on Power Play.
We are in the worst crisis of our lives. It takes a serious government. It takes a serious plan. It takes a plan that delivers today. It takes a plan that delivers investment. It takes a plan that grows this economy, stands up to Trump, and moves forward.
Change so that you can afford food and housing. Change so that you can live on a safe street. Change to put Canada first. Change is what we need now more than ever.
You have the power in this election to use that power to vote for New Democrats to say, no, I don't want to see cuts to healthcare. I don't want to see cuts to services. You've got the power to send us to Ottawa to hold the line for you, to defend what you care about.
Jagmeet Singh, Pierre Poilievre, and Mark Carney all on the campaign trail today, making their closing arguments ahead of next Monday's big vote. Some record numbers for advance voting as well. 7.3 million Canadians cast a ballot over the 4-day period for advance votes. That's 25% more than in the last election and does set an all-time record. As we head to Monday, I want to tell you a little bit about our coverage that evening. We certainly hope that you can join us. My colleague Omar Sachedina and I will lead our coverage here right across all of our platforms that you can see on the bottom of your screen. We will get underway at 7 o'clock Eastern, and within a few hours, we should start seeing the first results, which will undoubtedly be telling as we carry you through the results across the country, coast to coast to coast. Look forward to seeing you then. And of course, every night here on CTV News Channel for Power Play. I'll leave our program there for tonight. I'm Vashti Capellas. Thanks for watching and have a wonderful rest of your night.